Today, I'm going to be exploring every single abandoned location in Red Dead Redemption 2 and explaining the significance behind it and its lore in the game. Ewing Basin. Ewing Basin is the second town that you see in Red Dead Redemption, and it's actually an abandoned mining town that you'll see that the O'Driscolls are hidden up in the prologue chapter in chapter 1. And very similar to Coulter, Ewing Basin is also an abandoned mining town, and it seemed like it was probably pretty profitable, but eventually got abandoned because either the money ran out or they just couldn't keep it up in an area that often has a lot of snow. So I guess in this Ambarino area, there probably is a lot of snow during the winters, and that would probably also make it a lot harder to do mining, and especially when the mine is running out. When they've extracted all the resources, it does make sense to have abandoned it. And it does look like Ewing Basin got abandoned a little bit before Coulter did, and it also looks like Ewing Basin is a much bigger mining town than Coulter was, because it has a lot bigger of like a processing plant and a place where they're like taking all the ores down from the mines and putting them into one place. So it probably was a much bigger town before, but it looks like it was abandoned a lot before Coulter, so it seems like Ewing Basin might have been the first mining town in Ambarino in this area, and then they started making Coulter after it when this was super profitable, and they both went down pretty soon after once they had extracted all the mining resources from this area. You can also explore on top of some of the buildings to see where the mines were actually set up, and you can see that they're clearly in disrepair. This definitely happened over probably 10 years before the game started. I mean, when you're playing as John, you're almost 10 years after Arthur was playing, so this is probably like 20 years of disrepair here. You can see that everything has kind of collapsed in on itself, and it does make sense that this was like a nice area for the O'Driscolls to camp. Similar to Coulter, it just has a place where you can kind of hole up a lot of people because it is a mining town itself, and probably supported over like 200 to 250 people when it was in full swing. But I do wish both Coulter and Ewing Basin had a little bit more lore to them, because I feel like these are towns that could have had a little bit going on with them, maybe like a note here or there that showed the reason why Ewing Basin eventually had to be abandoned as a mining town. And I wish just Rockstar put a little bit more effort into these original towns, because these are the first two ones that you initially see at the start of the game, and the fact that they don't have like any associated lore when they're the very first places that you go to in the game just kind of sucks to me. Appleseed Timber Company. This is a really interesting abandoned place, and I had to put it on this list because this is technically an abandoned place in the epilogue, and I had to put all the epilogue places on because you can see how much of a huge change there is in Appleseed Timber Company from the beginning of the game to the end of the game. And I feel like a lot of people don't really return to some of these abandoned places in the epilogue of the game because you've kind of already done your exploring while you play as Arthur, and you don't need to explore as well when you're playing as John, besides like New Austin and the places you hadn't been to before. But checking out Appleseed Timber Company is actually really interesting while you're playing the game, because it kind of reflects the whole end of the Wild West thing, where it's like you have all the nature here, and nature is finally being controlled by people, where they can terraform whatever they want, and they can turn a whole entire forest into a bunch of just stumps. And you can see that this is like the end of the Wild West, because there finally is this industry coming, and they're finally taming the wilderness. There is no more Wild West anymore, and you can see that it's like also similar to like the capitalism thing. These people are coming in, they're cutting down all these trees, they're doing whatever they want to the environment, and they don't care about what they leave behind, because you know, they're just leaving behind all these different stumps and all this extra abandoned land that they have, and they're not actually like committing anything to the environment. They're just taking and giving nothing back. But I started to go up and look at the entire view of the Appleseed Timber Company from the top of this area, and it's kind of crazy to see how much they actually did deforest. I mean, especially when you're looking at the other parts of the forest behind it, it's so many of these huge old growth trees that they just came in and cut down to make a little bit of a profit, which is just insane to me. But again, it also does reflect the whole themes of the game, where the Wild West is finally gone and people are coming in and industrializing nature, and like finally can be able to control Mother Nature with like a timber company or any of the other things that they build. And nature is finally gone, and now people are forced to live in these cities. And then I went a little bit up, and I actually saw this guy who crashed in a wagon and actually has a dead body here, which is pretty interesting. It's like they have all these different little events all in the same area, so you can see all these different things. And when you inspect this document, you can see a picture of his bride, and it seems like this guy died on the way back to his wife after they got married, which is just insane. And you also see this guy at the top of the hill who knows this guy and realize he was like from the cabin down the way. But overall, this is a pretty cool place to visit, and it just really shows the themes of the game in like a really condensed area. The Van Horn Mansion. The Van Horn Mansion is a pretty interesting area because it kind of is this weird abandoned area that's right next to Van Horn, which in a sense kind of got abandoned itself when it became this like lawless town. So it's in a pretty weird area, and looking inside of it, you can just tell that it used to be someone's like rich house that they were having out here, and they lived in it with all their like servants or whatnot. But it eventually got abandoned, probably because Van Horn isn't really the safest place to live, and probably either robbers attacked them and took it over, or they just got moved out of it, and then people like bandits and thieves came and took it over after they were forced to leave and evacuate the property. But another thing that's really interesting that I saw from like the Any Austin video about the light poles in Red Dead Redemption 2 is that there's not any connection from the light poles into this house. And while there used to be, they don't have one anymore. And then when you go inside, you can actually see that they don't use any lights inside and it's only candles. So it's pretty interesting because Rockstar just put a lot of detail into this mansion itself, and you can actually see these two guys who are just sleeping there, which I'm assuming they're just regular boring thieves. But it's pretty interesting that there's actually like a mission in a sense in the mansion as well, even though it is pretty boring. Because once you try to pick up the money from these guys, the guy wakes up and then you have to do a little fighting with this guy, and it's honestly pretty easy to take them both out. And the other guy wakes up as well. But just in general, it is kind of cool to have this be like a robbery type thing, which I'm pretty sure if you go and take money from these guys, it counts as like a robbery in the in-game stats, which I like that part of it. But I just wish there could have been a little bit more to it than just it being these two guys inside that wake up when you try to steal the money from them. But overall, it is at least something interesting to happen when you go to this mansion. I do wish there was at least a little bit more lore of maybe the people inside that they were like, oh, this place got abandoned because we had to move out after Van Horn didn't live up to its original glory of it being like this nice trading post in the area and not this lawless hub that it eventually turned into. Like, I feel like that would be pretty cool, but I do understand that they can't have environmental storytelling in every single place in the entire game. And I do think at least having like people inside of it and having to rob the money from them is kind of cool. So it's overall an okay abandoned structure. And when I'm speaking of great abandoned structures, I think Hani's Bethel is one of the best abandoned structures in the entire game because there is kind of a whole story told when you do go inside of the cabin. So basically, Hani's Bethel was an original place for a cult to live, and the cult lived inside. They had a lot of time spent here. And if they all died at the exact same time using like the exact same poison or whatever, they thought that they would all ascend into the heavens at a specific time. You can see all these people are in their beds with the exact same shoes, which is pretty interesting because you can see that every single person who died here has the exact same shoes, which is really interesting to me. And it actually is a reference to a real life cult called the Heaven's Gate cult, which basically did the exact same thing. Of course, they weren't in an old house from the 1900s, but they're instead like a real life modern cult. And Rockstar just kind of lampooning off that to show what they're like. But they're actually a really interesting cult, and they have this note here that says, at the second hour under the half moon, by the great love and grace of our Savior, Kuakuaba, voyager of time and galaxies, we cast off our corporal shells so as vessels can take our spirit to the promised realm to live in peace and power until the 2000th year, when we will return for the new chosen and worship once again at the peak of Mount Sean. In his love we rejoice always. I'm pretty sure there's also a connection to the Mount Sean UFO mystery, which can also be seen in this thing, but it is just so interesting that this is based off a real life cult who's known to sue a lot of people. Lil Uzi Vert, who's like a rapper, he used their like photo, I guess, on his album cover, and they actually sued him for that. And they had like a couple people alive to like keep up the Heaven's Gate cult, even though I guess they couldn't ascend to the heaven like they wanted to. But if you do come back at the second hour, aka 2 a.m., something cool will happen. So I came back when it did eventually hit 2 a.m. and I headed back to Hani's Bethel. It is just kind of creepy to be in Red Dead Redemption at 2 a.m. because it is just kind of scary. I don't know. It's just kind of weird to be out this late in the game, but I did eventually head my way back to Hani's Bethel, and there's basically nothing going on until you actually go back into Hani's Bethel itself, where when you go inside, you will see a glowing green light above you, which is basically like a UFO. I think there's also like a UFO on Mount Sean. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that's why they have the Mount Sean thing. Or if you go at a specific time on Mount Sean, I'm assuming it's also 2 a.m., but I'm not 100% sure. You can see a UFO there as well. But once you leave and try to like look at the UFO, it will eventually go away. But overall, this is just an amazing abandoned place and does really have a cool mystery to it. The abandoned mission in New Austin. This one doesn't really have that much lore behind it, but it basically is just an abandoned and like burned down mission in New Austin that you can go and see. It also has a lockbox that you can go and find and get a little bit of stuff out of, but nothing really crazy about it. This does have a little bit of a connection to the Jesuit missionary from the point of interest videos I made, where the Jesuit missionary was probably going to see this mission here because it's the only mission in the entire game, and probably it makes the most sense as the place the Jesuit missionary was trying to go, as this one does seem to be abandoned for a while, and it does seem like the Jesuit missionary was dead for a while, but there's not like anything really conclusively linking them together, and this is just kind of a boring abandoned place. There's not really much going on. It's just a structure that's destroyed in New Austin, and I'm assuming this is just likely a little bit of a smaller place because they had to cut a lot of stuff from the game. Fort Brennan. Fort Brennan is an abandoned military fort in the New Hanover area, very close to like Roanoke Ridge area-ish, and like Lemoyne at the same time. And it's very similar to like Fort Wallace, where it's just a military fort made out of wood. And it's actually a pretty cool place. It does have a little bit of a connection to the Lemoyne Raiders because Lindsay Wofford, who is a bounty target, you can actually find him and his goons in this area. So I think it was used as like a gang hideout for the Lemoyne Raiders, or at least for Lindsay Wofford. And just in general, there's a lot of cool lore surrounding this area. It was actually used as a place during the Civil War where Quincy Harris, who's a major commander of the Confederate Army in the game and has like a statue in Lemoyne, he and his men came inside the fort at night and basically got inside the fort and started shooting at the Union soldiers inside, and it basically turned into a massacre where a lot of the Union soldiers stationed at Fort Brennan did not live. But there's also a lot of other things that you can find at this fort, where you can find this Civil War knife. There's also like a hat that you can find in the basement as well, and a Civil War report, which I'm going to read to you right now. So in the basement, there's also a gold nugget in the chest where you can find the Civil War report. But overall, this is a really interesting thing that kind of sheds a light on a lot of what Fort Brennan actually is. Confederate soldiers under General Quincy Harris attacked Fort Brennan that night, climbed trees to fire down into the fort, and then battered and broke through the north gate. All survivors being executed and bodies burned. I am next. First Lieutenant Ronald Algier. So I guess this first lieutenant thought that they were eventually going to get taken over by the Confederates here because they were coming in, sneaking in at night, and having a lot of success by taking the Union soldiers by surprise. But I'm assuming that the Union actually did win, in that a lot of the people that survived this massacre actually did come out on the other side. There's also like a newspaper article which talks about like U.S. Army veterans that relived the massacre and actually survived through it, and it seems like a lot of them did survive. So I guess technically Ronald Algier probably did survive, and he actually was safe, because I think the South had a lot more important issues to worry about, because like a year later they started losing the war, and they had like the Battle of the Scarlet Meadows, and just all the things that kind of like are fictionalized in the game that are technically based on real events started to happen. So I don't really think the Confederates had that good of a time after this point in the war, and they probably also like lost the Battle of Gettysburg around this time as well. So it kind of turned against the Confederates at this time. But I guess like being a Union soldier in here and being like a sitting duck in this fort where they're coming in at night and shooting a lot of the people in your fort would kind of suck. And I feel like I'd be so scared if you're a soldier in there, because you think that every single night it could be your night to die. Roadside Brothel. Roadside Brothel is an abandoned place in the New Hanover area right by Annesburg, and it says that it was actually established in 1850. It's called Madame Moselle's house or the roadside brothel, and you can probably see Madame Moselle outside. This is probably her, just because I don't know who else would be outside the roadside brothel and actually be like a dead corpse, but it probably is her outside. And actually under her chair you can actually find a fertility statue, which is the female fertility statue and is one of the 2 fertility statues that you can find in game. But overall, this is a pretty boring abandoned place. I wish this was just something you could go inside, but it does at least have a little bit of lore to it where you can actually find Madame Moselle outside. And I think Madame Moselle probably closed down the roadside brothel pretty close to when you can actually find it in game, because it does seem like it kind of got passed over by Annesburg and the railroad. And the fact that she's sitting outside means it probably was like only like 5 or 6 years before the game actually happened when she died, because there's like flies buzzing around her body. So it was probably like 5 or 6 years ago when the brothel itself closed, and then she died like right before the game happened. But it probably is pretty likely that it just got passed over by people going to Annesburg instead for a brothel or like prostitutes, instead of going to like a specific place that they have to go on the road where it's like there's not as many travelers coming through, so it had to be closed down. Coulter. Coulter is the very first abandoned town and the very first place you go in the entire game. And it is a pretty interesting town because it seems like it was an abandoned mining town, but at the same time there is like a barn there, and it seems like they're feeding a lot of animals, so maybe there is like something else going on besides it just being a mining town, because there is a pretty huge barn here, and I guess maybe they had like animals working in the mine. I don't really know how that would work. Maybe they were doing like milling or something. I don't really understand it, but Coulter is a really interesting town to explore because it is the very first town you go to in the entire game. And going to a place that like feels very familiar if you've played through Red Dead Redemption a lot, because you're in Coulter like the first beginning of the game, and it's like the very first place you explore, but at the same time there's not that much like exploration to do in the Coulter area. So Coulter feels really familiar because you have a lot of time and you spend a lot of time there at the beginning of the game, but at the same time it doesn't feel as familiar as a place like Shady Belle or Clemens Point or Horseshoe Overlook, because you don't really spend a lot of time compared to the other camps. So it is a pretty interesting place to explore, because I feel like a lot of these places you kind of glaze over because no one really likes to play chapter 1 and spend a lot of time there because you can't explore the rest of the map. But there are some interesting places, like you have the Pearson's place where he's like cooking all the food, and then you have like the cabin where Lenny, Bill, Micah, I think, were all living in this cabin. And it's just kind of funny because this place was so derelict right now, and during the game I guess they turned it into like a kind of cozy place, but the fact that like 4 people were living in here is just kind of crazy, because clearly it's made for like 2 people maximum, and the time there were 4 different gang members living in here. I understand it was the snow, but still it's just kind of crazy to pack all those people into that really tiny spot. And then you can go into the bigger house where like Arthur was staying for a while, and I think Dutch and Molly were also in this house as well. I'm not 100% sure on that, but it was super interesting to me when exploring this place to find these places that are like vaguely familiar in your head because you've played through these missions a lot of times, but you're not really a place that's like so familiar as like Beaver Hollow or Horseshoe Overlook, because I don't really spend a lot of time in chapter 1. And these places that are like, yeah, vaguely familiar, because I remember Arthur going to sleep in this room, but at the same time there's like 2 missions that do that, and you're not spending a lot of time in Coulter where you're like really memorizing every specific place. So it's very interesting to go back to these places that have like a shadow in my memory, but don't have like a specific thing that I can tie back to Coulter, because there's only 6 missions in the first chapter, so it's like not that interesting. You don't really spend that much time in Coulter in general. And then you can also visit the house where John was actually staying and recuperating from his sickness, and of course the scratches on his faces. So this is pretty interesting because you can clearly tell that it was like a schoolhouse that was renovated into a place that was taking care of John. You can see the place where I think both John and the Calendar brother like died there, which I don't know. It's just a pretty interesting place, and seeing it in different views in like each context where it's like, oh, John literally was staying there in one of the missions, but not really like exploring the rest of the cabin, because you don't understand that it was a schoolhouse if you just looked at it through those couple of missions. And when you look at it this time, it's like, oh, you actually realize that it is a schoolhouse because you can see all the pews, and you see all these other cabins that are just randomly in there and destroyed, and you just wonder what they're supposed to be used for before. I'm assuming they're all just houses of people because there's like an outhouse behind them, but it's just interesting to see how like Rockstar can show how like a place went from a real mining town into something that's fully abandoned, and seeing like each of the houses in each of these things that like a regular town would have, like a church and a graveyard. These are all things that a regular town would have, but maybe you don't put them in an abandoned town because you don't really need to put them there. But of course, Coulter does need that because it needs to be the first place you go, and it needs to really feel like a real town that you're going into, and something that has like real people that have lived there. And going inside the church, you can tell that Coulter was clearly like the more of a real town than something like Ewing Basin, which probably only had like a lot of men there. This one is probably more for families and more for people who are really committing to here, because this does have, of course, like a church and a schoolyard and all these different houses, instead of like Ewing Basin, which seemed like it just had the really big mine there. So I'm assuming Ewing Basin was a lot more used for mining, and this was used for a little bit of everything, because it seems like there's a lot more families here than Ewing Basin had because of like the church and the schoolhouse. And just in general, Coulter seems like a real town versus Ewing Basin. It really seems like a mining outpost, because there's a lot of other things that really make it feel real and lived in. And I understand why they wanted Coulter to feel like a real lived in town, because it's the very first place that the gang does visit. Also in Coulter, you can find Davy Calendar's gravestone, and you can actually inspect it. If you do want to get 100% completion, you do have to go to every single gravestone in the entire game. And this is one of the most important ones because it is the very first death in the entire game, and it does like kind of start this Van der Linde gang going down the rabbit hole and losing a lot more people. Also, a little bit north of Coulter, you can actually find Jenny Kirk's grave, another person that wasn't actually in the game of Red Dead Redemption 2, but was a member of the gang at one point. And this is probably where they came from before eventually stopping in Coulter, because Jenny did die a little bit before Davy Calendar, and they wanted to probably bury her body as soon as possible as to not keep up the dead weight. The next place I went to was the Bear Claw Camp. The Bear Claw Camp really isn't a major thing in Red Dead Redemption 2, but does have a couple of missions that happen there in Red Dead Redemption 1. But the lore from Red Dead Redemption 1 says that this is just a bunch of rotting cabins that were usually used as like a logging camp, and they're logging some stuff in this area before eventually abandoning these structures and leaving them to rot because they're just log cabins. But it's not really used in either game that much. It's used in two missions in Red Dead Redemption 1 where you meet Dutch's gang here, and in Red Dead Redemption 2 it's just used in one singular mission, and that's the bounty mission in the epilogue with Sadie called A Really Big Bastard, where the bear attacks you. But overall, these structures aren't really used for all that much in the games because there's not really that much going on with them. I wish there was a little bit more lore to them, but they kind of are just these structures that are just randomly in Red Dead Redemption 1, and because they had to be in Red Dead Redemption 1, they're also in Red Dead Redemption 2, and it's just kind of hard to like explore more of the lore when it's just from Red Dead Redemption 1, and it wasn't used until Arthur's section, and I know Rockstar cut a lot of stuff that they wanted to put into the game during John's section, or at least the time you play as John and Arthur in supposedly New Austin in this area as well, but eventually they just went with the Blackwater thing, and that Arthur wasn't allowed to explore any of these areas because that just made the most sense, and because a lot of this stuff in the areas of Red Dead Redemption 1 were just kind of half-baked. So it doesn't really have that much lore going on with it, but there are a couple of things that you can find here. And the main one of those is that when you jump into this well and go all the way down to the bottom of it, which I did, and I took a lot of damage when doing this, but there actually is a lockbox at the bottom of here that does have a couple of good things. Even though it probably isn't worth it to jump down here, there is, I think, like $90 down here. So if you do want a little bit of money during the epilogue because you can't get this as Arthur, maybe it's fine to go here as John. Also, John has like really weird eyes when you go into this cave. I don't know if that's a glitch. I don't really know what that is, but John just looks extremely weird in this cave. Braithwaite Manor. Braithwaite Manor is another place that wasn't abandoned during the game, but did eventually get abandoned due to the fact that it literally got burned down by the Van der Linde gang in that one mission at the end of Chapter 3. So it is pretty interesting, and the fact that the whole Braithwaite Manor thing has been fully abandoned after the fact is pretty cool. And also there is a pretty interesting thing that's happened, which I feel like is the only time in the entire game where a new civilization, in a sense, has spawned up after the fact in 1907. You can also loot Catherine Braithwaite's body and get a brooch from her, which is also kind of funny. It's just the fact that you can loot her body and you can see her charred dead body, even when it's like 8 years after the game's events. But the main thing that most people probably would return to the abandoned Braithwaite Manor for is the gold bar that you can actually find in under one of the walls in Braithwaite Manor, which is actually really hard to find. It is kind of blocked off by a bunch of the foliage here, but you can eventually go to it and find some gold bars, which is really nice. I mean, you have to get every single gold bar you can get in the entire game. The coolest thing about Braithwaite Manor, though, is that it seems like there's been a new civilization or new town that's kind of sprung up here after Braithwaite Manor got burned down, where a lot of the people that are probably working on Braithwaite Manor itself have seemed to start a fishing village, because I was looking around Braithwaite Manor, and I've gone to Braithwaite Manor a lot in the game, and I had never thought there were this many people around this area. So it must be something that Rockstar did that eventually got more people in this area, and it's just super interesting to me, because people just left Braithwaite Manor to be fully abandoned. They didn't take over anything else, and they really just started making this abandoned village, an abandoned area where they're working before, their actual town, which is pretty cool. And it's just the only time in the entire game where there's something that really feels like human that has changed from the beginning of the game to the epilogue, which is just, I don't know, it's crazy to me, because you can clearly tell that there's way more people in this area during this time. They seem a lot friendlier than when they're working before, and I don't know, it's just so weird to me that this is the only place in the entire game where it really feels like the humans and the people in the game have actually changed, where it feels like a lived-in place after the fact. And it's just a really weird thing to me. I really hope that Rockstar could do something like this in GTA 6, because it would just be really cool to see like the development of a city from one time to the next time, and just see how that would work. Emerald Ranch and the saloon and general store. So at Emerald Ranch, technically it was like kind of a bigger settlement, and they had a saloon and general store, but they've been abandoned because it seems like Emerald Ranch is a little bit downsizing as a ranch. I guess the ranch owner is pretty like technical about his privacy and doesn't want anything to happen. But the saloon does have a whole nother reason for being abandoned. If you do go into the saloon, you can see a couple of bullet holes in the side or like the wall of the saloon, and you can also see a lot of blood on the ground. And I guess there was a shooting here where a ranch hand named Joshua Burgess was shot, and he eventually died in a supposed accidental shooting. But you can clearly see when you're inside the saloon that this was no accident, and clearly someone got into a fight with him and they shot him and he died. And Joshua Burgess, the guy who actually died there, was actually in a relationship, or like some sort of relationship, with Miriam Wagner, who is the daughter of the person who owns Emerald Ranch. And she's like the daughter you can see in the window if you go into Emerald Ranch at night. She like looks out the window and is just really creepy staring out the window. But she was actually in a relationship with this guy, and I'm assuming because of that, maybe someone got into a fight with him and then they shot him. And because it probably wasn't an accident, it was probably either a hit from someone else who was trying to get with Miriam Wagner, or maybe her father as well. I guess it's probably turned into a scandal in Emerald Ranch, and is likely why Emerald Ranch is not as big of a settlement as it was before. And this is likely why they abandoned the barn in Emerald Ranch, why they abandoned the general store in Emerald Ranch, and why the saloon is also abandoned, because the guy who owns Emerald Ranch probably realizes it's more profitable just to operate the ranch itself and to not provide other things that might cause way more of a scandal. And that's why Emerald Ranch does have these abandoned things. It is kind of sad, because Emerald Ranch is a pretty cool area to be in. I feel like it's actually a pretty beautiful location, and the fact that they had to close down both the saloon and the general store, which could have been pretty cool places to go to, just kind of sucks. And it's also just funny that there's like an abandoned thing in a settlement itself. It shows that the settlement itself definitely has some even tougher times coming forward, because if a saloon and general store closed down, which probably everyone living at the ranch would be using, that means that there's probably a lot worse things that are going to happen soon. if they don't start to make more money, because if you're not at your heyday, you probably are going to try to make even more money, and then it's going to be even harder to make more profits, which just in general starts kind of like this death spiral down, especially when there's like new farms that can probably compete with the Emerald Ranch people. But overall, there is like a nice mystery about the Emerald Ranch abandoned buildings, and there is some solid lore behind them, which did make this really interesting to learn about. The Wapiti Reservation. So the Wapiti Reservation, similar to like Braithwaite Manor and some of the other ones that were abandoned, is only abandoned in the epilogue. So if you go to this, I mean, it's not going to be abandoned during the actual game because the Wapiti haven't left. But if you go back in the epilogue, you can see that the Wapiti camp is basically fully cleared out. There are a couple of TPs still up that it does seem like they just rushed out and couldn't take down themselves, but there's basically nothing going on in the Wapiti Reservation. There are, of course, like still the houses that were left up before, but there's only one big change that changed from when it was in the regular game to what happens in the epilogue. And that one major change is there is like an oil drill where you can see the Cornwall Oil Company came in and tested for the oil. And what they realized was that the Wapiti Reservation actually didn't have any oil, and that's why this is fully abandoned as a reservation and as an oil drilling place, because it both wasn't a good place for the Wapiti to live and it wasn't a good place for them to drill any oil. So both of those things just left this place abandoned. And it's kind of sad because there's basically nothing going on at the Wapiti Reservation, a place that used to have a lot of life that changes something that basically is a ghost town in the epilogue. And I do wonder if it was the Cornwall Company that was the one who were doing the oil pump on the Wapiti land, because I'm not 100% sure, but I'm assuming the Cornwall Oil Company probably got sold to someone else right after Leviticus Cornwall died, because you can see that the Cornwall Tar and Kerosene, another place that we're going to be visiting today, is also abandoned by the time of the epilogue. So I don't know if Cornwall himself and his companies were the ones that were actually operating on the Wapiti land, because he was probably dead by this time, but it could be pretty interesting if another company had bought it up, still wanted that land, and then drove them off, because it was all just so futile and they should have never been driven off in the first place. The Old Greenbank Mill. So the Old Greenbank Mill is a mill that's set on Dewberry Creek, where this is where the Vanderland gang was trying to camp at a point. It's this dried up riverbed, which is pretty cool, and you can clearly tell why the mill actually eventually did get abandoned, because you really can't run a mill when there's no water that's going to be running the mill, because a mill is going to have the little water wheel that eventually runs and does whatever they're doing inside. I don't know what they're doing inside. They're probably milling some flour or doing something else like that. But just in general, this is a pretty interesting mill, even though there isn't that much going on here, because it is used in the one bounty mission that John does with Sadie, where they meet the guy Ramon Cortez, and his whole gang is kind of camped out in this area. And there are a couple things that you can actually find here, including valerian root, which you can find in this windowsill right here, and you can pick up. It's pretty easy to do. But you can also find a little bit of loot at the bottom of the mill, where you can get a little bit of a coin cup and a couple other things that you can find at the very bottom of the mill in this lockbox right here. But overall, the mill isn't all that interesting. I do wish there was a way to go inside the mill, but you can't really do that. You don't really understand any of the lore behind it. It is just kind of a structure that you can find in the game that's like kind of cool to look at, but doesn't have any actual substance to it. But there is one final cool thing, that if you go over to the railway tracks that's right by it and wait until it's actually 3 a.m., you can see one of the coolest things in the entire game of Red Dead Redemption 2, which is the ghost train. So the ghost train comes through here and it crosses over like the New Hanover and Lemoyne border right by this area at 3 a.m. And if you do go here at 3 a.m., you can actually find it yourself. And while I don't think the ghost train is all that amazing of a thing to see, it is one of the things that would catch you so off guard if you do see it without actually knowing that the ghost train is a real thing in the game. Maycomb's End. Maycomb's End is a pretty interesting location that can be found in the mission American Distillation, where you do fight off some Lemoyne Raiders in this area after you blow up the Lemoyne Raiders distillation plant. But there really isn't much going on in Maycomb's End itself. You can find a couple of areas where you can get loot in Maycomb's End, but it clearly seems that Maycomb's End has been abandoned for a long time, and it likely got abandoned because a lot of these like fishing villages in this area have also been going very down. Like if you look at like Lakay, which we're also going to be visiting, and Le Gras, those are both areas that are similar fishing villages to Maycomb's End that also have been really on the decline in recent years, with Lakay fully being abandoned and Le Gras basically having no one there but the main population that probably doesn't have that much of a chance in Saint Denis or whatever. But overall, Maycomb's End just doesn't have much going on at all. I mean, there isn't really any lore about it, and it's not even used really in Red Dead Redemption 2 or Red Dead Redemption Online. It really just is a setting for a shootout in the game, and it's not even in an interesting mission at all. So, I don't know, Maycomb's End is just a really disappointing place to me, but now we're going to be checking out a couple of the other places around it to see why it may have been actually abandoned. And then when you go across the river from this, you can see a little house over here, which also seems to be abandoned. So I guess just living in Lemoyne in the swamp probably isn't the greatest if you're just trying to be a fisherman, because you're competing with a lot of other fishermen and you really can't make any more money than what you need to survive. So this probably wouldn't be the greatest for economy. And then checking out some of the other places, this is another fishing dock away from it. And this one actually doesn't seem to be fully abandoned. And the reason for that is that this is likely a fishing dock for a specific plantation out here, which I've actually never seen before in the game. I don't know how that's ever happened, but let's go check it out. So this is actually like an orange plantation. It's called Hagen Gardens, which this is probably the only beneficial thing that you can actually grow in Lemoyne. And the people that are instead fishing or trying to do something else to make money probably just aren't doing the right thing, because, you know, at least growing oranges, you can actually sell them off and make a bit of a profit, but doing fishing, you really can't do that. So now we go to another one of the Van der Linde gang's eventual camps for a bit, and this is actually Lakay, the area they stayed right in Chapter 5 at the end, and stayed for a little bit before the Pinkertons raided them here. And you can actually go in Lakay and go in one of these dilapidated houses that's kind of sunken into the swamp. I mean, this is clearly why they don't live here anymore, because some of the houses are sunken into the swamp. And go in here and get a cat mask, which is pretty funny, and I have to wear this for the rest of the video because this is just the most troll mask I can ever get. John wearing a cat skull mask is pretty funny. And then when looking around the rest of Lakay, you can see exactly why it has been abandoned. It just seems like a lot of the people here were like voodoo practitioners or doing something else in the swamp, and that likely isn't going to make you the most amount of money, and it probably just gets you people that would live there for a little bit of time but aren't going to be living there for the longest, because they don't really feel like this is like a long-term home. And it doesn't seem like these people have really produced anything besides making these weird voodoo rituals that are somehow in every single one of the cabins here. I don't know, it's just kind of weird when you see a bunch of random skulls lying around every single place in Lakay. And clearly these people were doing some weird stuff. So maybe they're making some money by selling voodoo rituals to other people and saying, Dutch, we can get you to Tahiti just for $500. I'm just going to give you a voodoo ritual that's going to teleport you there. And just when you look around all these cabins, you can see that these probably weren't the most cool people to hang around. They just have some weird stuff going on, some creepy paintings, and clearly when they're doing rituals that are involving weird things and involving like voodoo, it just probably isn't the greatest people you'd want to hang around, and probably doesn't get them a lot of people coming in and being like, oh, I really love this place and I really think it's a good place to check out. Like even Le Gras, I feel like would have a lot more like visitors coming in, because at least they seem to be kind of welcoming as a community. The people in Lakay are just voodoo practitioners that probably get nothing done, and that's very likely why this place got abandoned, because it's going to be basically impossible to make any money when you're a voodoo practitioner, and when they eventually ran out of all the money that they did have, they probably had to abandon it. But there's actually a really weird item that you can find in one of the voodoo rituals that they have down here. And if you go into this voodoo ritual and you find this little clay pot, you can go inside and shoot it, and you can find a shrunken head inside, which just shows they're doing some really weird stuff in Lakay and probably weren't the coolest people to hang around. And just in general, I feel like it's very similar to Coulter. This is a very interesting place to check out after the fact, because you don't really spend a lot of time in Lakay. It really is only like one mission, because you get there and the shootout immediately happens right after that. So very similar to Coulter, it is a place that is like vaguely familiar to you, but you don't really know it besides the one or two missions that you actually go there, and if you do eventually return to this place. So it was just kind of interesting checking out like what Lakay actually looked like besides the cutscenes you can see in the game and like where everyone was actually hiding out, because Lakay really is a small settlement. It doesn't seem like much is going on here, and that's probably why it was only used as a temporary camp, because this is kind of hard to house every single member of the Van der Linde gang. Now we go to Saint Denis, and right outside Saint Denis, you can see the slaughterhouse, and especially when you're going up the bridge, this is like this huge building right outside Saint Denis, and it's actually fully abandoned. So this is the Prinz & Co. slaughterhouse. You can see outside that it's a slaughterhouse because there are just so many dead animal bodies and bones out here, which just is some pretty good environmental storytelling, because you can clearly tell that it's a slaughterhouse even without like looking into the slaughterhouse itself. But this is a really weird one to me, because I don't understand why no other company would have taken over the Prinz & Co. slaughterhouse. I feel like this is a pretty prime position to have stuff shipped to the outside. And even if Prinz & Co. did eventually go fully bankrupt, I feel like this would be the perfect place to set up something, because you don't have to be fully in Saint Denis. You can maybe pay people from outside of Saint Denis and pay them lower wages instead of the people in Saint Denis. You also can get a great view of Saint Denis from the top of the building, which is also pretty cool. The most interesting thing about Prinz & Co. to me, though, is that this was supposed to be a gang hideout either in between Lakay and Beaver Hollow, or in between Shady Belle and Lakay, and I guess it just got scrapped for some reason pretty early in development, and likely this is just due to because if there was a gang hideout right outside Saint Denis where they're very, very wanted criminals, it probably wouldn't make sense, because anyone would be like, wait, there's some wanted criminals in this place right outside Saint Denis. There's all these people coming and going from Saint Denis, and of course like a slaughterhouse would probably clearly see a lot of activity if there was a full gang hidden out in there, and especially when it's right next to the bridge to Saint Denis, someone would probably realize that there are people in there and hanging out and chilling in there, and when they're wanted criminals, people would maybe be keeping their eyes out a little bit more than they would for just random squatters in there. But this is like 99% the reason why this place actually was abandoned, because they wanted it to be this gang hideout, and it can't not be abandoned to be a gang hideout, because if this was a business here, they can't just be taking it over as a gang hideout. But because of this, they eventually had to scrap the idea, because it just doesn't really make sense. And that's why Prinz & Co. probably doesn't have that much lore to it. I mean, you can see some like mangy dogs outside that have made Prinz & Co. their home, because I guess it was like a slaughterhouse before, and there's probably like a lot of food that they could get by just standing outside here. But just in general, there's not that much going on with Prinz & Co. because it is just this place that was supposed to be a gang hideout but eventually got scrapped. And now we go over to the abandoned church. This is in Lemoyne, right next to the Battle of Scarlet Meadows, which is also known as Bulger Glade. It is also technically a point of interest, but you go to it in that mission where you and Lenny go to Shady Belle to take out the Lemoyne Raiders. But basically the reason why this church was actually abandoned was during the Battle of Bulger Glade / Scarlet Meadows, the Confederate army actually had gunpowder in here, and it actually exploded in the church after someone set fire to it, and it basically made the church unable to be used at all, so they had to eventually abandon it. Also in the church, there is a lockbox that you can pick up that does have a jewelry bag and a little bit of money. So there are a couple of things that you can go and get in the church. I think there's also more things if you go as Arthur than as John, because there were a couple things I saw on some videos that were definitely in there where there's like 2 other lockboxes, but they disappeared for me, which I think is just because the Lemoyne Raiders left the church eventually, or I don't really know. They weren't on there for me. But either way, the church is kind of an interesting location. It is just kind of this boring old church, and I feel like very similar to the mission. It's a cool place, but it's just a general boring location. Like, there's not that much going on with it. And I kind of wish they did a lot more stuff with it, because it is involved in the Battle of Scarlet Meadows, and the fact that the only thing that is like used in terms of lore is that the fact that this thing got blown up during the Battle of Scarlet Meadows, it's kind of just sad to me, because I feel like they could have had like maybe some bullet holes in here, or like a dead body under the rubble or something. I don't know. I just feel like they could have added a little bit more lore to it, just based on the fact that it's right next to the Civil War battlefield. Fort Riggs. Fort Riggs is an extremely interesting location to me, because the only way you kind of know about Fort Riggs is if you get this weird random encounter with a drunk soldier who tells you about all the horrors that happened at Fort Riggs and how they basically just like interned all these Native Americans at Fort Riggs and basically turned it into like an internment camp for all these Native Americans. And he says that there are all these horrors that happened in the camp itself, and that he kind of regrets doing all of that, and that's why he just starts drinking all the time to kind of not think about those moments ever. It also is this fort that's kind of pretty close to like the initial camp at Horseshoe Overlook. And when you go there, you can also see like all the teepees set up here as well. So you can clearly tell that it doesn't really look like a normal US Army fort, at least compared to like Fort Wallace and Fort Brennan that we already explored today. And it just looks a lot more in disrepair because it was used as a place to basically intern Wapiti people, and it turned into like the place where a lot of these people live. And also, this area kind of bears resemblance a little bit to the Lakota area of Wounded Knee, which was used in the Wounded Knee Massacre, where over like 200 Lakota people were massacred by the U.S. Army. So I'm assuming this is kind of just a reference to that, where the people here were also massacred in a way. I'm not 100% sure how many of them got massacred, but the drunk army guy that you can talk to actually does say that some of the people here were massacred, but it was basically like this internment camp, similar to what happened to the Japanese in World War II, where they were taken into these camps where they couldn't really do much. And it's very similar here as well, where they're taken into this internment camp. A lot of them died here. They couldn't really do much, and they're just forced to be in captivity. It's just like a jail, but without it being like a real jail. Another thing that's really interesting is the schoolhouse that you can go to inside of Fort Riggs, where you can see this schoolhouse, which I'm assuming they were using it to teach the Native Americans like how to be an English person, how to be a proper American, and how to speak English and do all that and all these things that they would want a normal American to do instead of like all the Native American things. They got to change their name. They got to do all these things to become regular American citizens and not Native Americans, and kind of get away from what they were living on their tribe. You can also find this English spelling practice thing, which basically has a hidden poem in it. And if you look at the first letter of each word in there, it has this poem here, which says, "Waziah comes with winter breath, his trees stand guard, whispering all night that we sleep in our grave. Father fought and died so quickly, mother dies slow." So basically it's a poem about how his family is basically dying around him, and all the people at this like setup here at Fort Riggs are all dying extremely quickly because of the really bad treatment that the army has, and that they're basically just taking advantage of these people, putting them in squalor, and they're just dying really quickly. It just shows how bad the treatment of Native Americans was at this time, where they're trying to have just regular lives and live. And you can see like all these dead bodies and graves out here as well. In general, the Native Americans were treated extremely harshly during this time, and they basically had all this land, and the American government just wanted the land, so they took it over and they deported these people out of their native land. So it just sucked for these people, and clearly like Fort Riggs and the U.S. Army were clearly the people that were doing it the most. There also is this really interesting grave to the southwest of the location that has like all these like Native American burials there. And some people say it's involved in the Fort Riggs and how these people were treated, but it likely is related to the Curse of Valentine, because that is like related to the Native American massacre that happened right on Valentine. And since those people were massacred there, it's pretty similar to the massacre at Fort Riggs that happened as well. And they probably were connected and shared some of the same people in both of them. And now we move over to Cornwall Tar and Kerosene. Cornwall Tar and Kerosene is a really interesting place to me because it was the biggest business probably during the actual game itself and not during the epilogue. And by the time it gets to the epilogue, this is a place that's completely abandoned, and that's mainly due to the fact of the Native American attack on Cornwall Tar and Kerosene and the fact that the Vanderlyn gang was involved in that, because they did do a lot of damage to Cornwall Tar and Kerosene, and they basically killed the guy who had the most stake in Cornwall Tar and Kerosene, and it could have been hard for someone else to either take over his stake in Cornwall Tar and Kerosene and take over exactly what he's doing here and maybe rebuild it, and instead they just wanted to abandon it. But it doesn't really fully make sense to me, because if it was so powerful and so valuable that everyone wanted a piece of this, and that Cornwall was doing some extremely bad things to a lot of people just because they were somewhat hurting his business, why wouldn't someone else like J.D. McKnight, who took over a lot of the other things that Cornwall owned around the map, why wouldn't he just invest a little bit more money into the Cornwall stuff here and start an oil refinery again and the tar and kerosene stuff again as well? I don't know why he wouldn't do it, but I guess there probably is some reason in game why he kind of took over everything else and didn't take over Cornwall Tar and Kerosene. Again, it might just make sense that there was too much damage done to it where it wouldn't have been profitable to invest all that money in when there wasn't that much oil reserves in this area, because they had already depleted a lot of this stuff, and maybe because of the Wapiti setup as well. if the Wapiti stuff had a lot of oil there, then this would have come back. But since the Wapitis never had any oil under their land, or at least very little oil under their land, they never were able to restart up Cornwall Tar and Kerosene. I'm also just surprised that everything, although it's been fully abandoned, isn't really all that destroyed, because I would assume some of these things would be pretty valuable to someone and at least be like stripped around for parts. And it's just kind of this area that's like boarded up and you can't go inside Cornwall Tar and Kerosene, but they still have like all these valuable tanks that might be used for something. I just feel like if it was a little bit more realistic, these places would have at least been somewhat stripped for parts. They wouldn't have just been fully left here and left to rot in nature, because that just doesn't really make sense. I mean, there has to be something valuable here that they could at least like melt down and sell for parts that way. But I guess like I understand that Rockstar can't be doing all this stuff to make the game like the most realistic possible. But I also just wish you could go inside of this area. Like, I feel like it just is kind of a cop out to be like, oh, you guys can't go inside this area that you've already been inside before. Like, at least they could just keep it a little bit similar inside and just put a couple things so that you're like, oh, I know it's abandoned. But I don't know. I do understand it, but I just feel like this is the most valuable business in the entire game, one of the coolest places to visit in the entire game, and when it's abandoned, it is just kind of a boring place to go to. The town of Pleasance. So the town of Pleasance is probably the most known abandoned place in Red Dead Redemption 2, because there is a whole mystery around why Pleasance actually was abandoned. A lot of people think it's the plague, because there are a bunch of signs around town that say like stay out plague or unclean sinners or ill with sin. And there's a lot of different things that seem like there might have been a plague, but some of those signs also give mixed messages, like unclean sinners and ill with sin. Like, of course they might be sick in some way, but it could just be a cover up for something else. But there was an actual massacre here, and that's what happened to a lot of these people. They were all massacred at one point, and they were all found their bodies after the fact, and the entire town was massacred by one person who is still unfound to this day. People don't know if it was because of the plague that they were massacred, or if there's some other reason that they were actually massacred. There's also a lot of different theories that people think why they did get massacred. Some of the people say that they were Satan worshippers because the town church actually doesn't have a cross above it. But there's also a lot of other things that could have happened to Pleasance. It might just be someone that murdered them, and then they just put up all these things that said, oh, you're a sinner, you have a plague that's coming, and all these other things that like may have taken the blame off of this original person that murdered them. Maybe they just all had the plague and someone didn't want to get the plague themselves, so they killed all of them. I don't know. There's a lot of different things that could happen to Pleasance, and it is based on like a real life town called Helltown, which had like some similar things that happened to it, where they had like radioactive waste dumped in the area. And in the real life place, they actually were worshipped by Satanists, because that's why they called it Helltown. But it just is so interesting, because Pleasance really has no concrete theories of like why this happened, and it is just left up to the player's interpretation if it was just someone on a rampage out there that wanted to unclean all these people that had sin, and maybe they all were Satanists because they were ill with sin and they're these unclean sinners. Or maybe it just was someone out on a rampage themselves. There's a lot of different reasons of why this town could have been fully abandoned, but it mainly was because every single person died. It's also really interesting because you can go to the front of the town and you can see that the town was only founded 1 year before they actually had this unfortunate massacre happen to them. So even though it is called Pleasance, it is kind of tongue-in-cheek, because clearly the worst things happen to these guys, because they immediately start their town, they have a couple of buildings up, and they immediately all die 1 year after doing that. So it is just such a sad tale. And it just kind of sucks for all these people, because some of them were children, some of them were like the family members of the children, and it just seems like they're trying to do a good thing. Maybe they were sinners, maybe they were Satanists themselves, but did they really deserve to die? Did they really deserve to be massacred by one person? Probably not. There also are a lot of theories about this giant orange snake that you can find in the forest right by the town itself, and I don't know what this snake means. A lot of people think it's like an Adam and Eve reference. Some people think it's a reference to the Helltown, the one that's based on in real life, which supposedly had like really long snakes because of the chemical spill there as well. I don't really know what it is either. Limpany. Limpany is the final abandoned place that we're going to be going to in this video, and Limpany is probably the most interesting one to me, because there isn't really a big reason why this town was fully abandoned. It also is a lot bigger than Pleasance. Like, clearly the whole town got burned down, so it does make sense why people don't live here anymore. But at the same time, it is a much bigger location than something like Pleasance, where there's only like 4 or 5 houses. Limpany does have a whole huge booming town with a saloon there, with a general store, with a whole jail. And this would have been a really cool place to explore. And I hope maybe in a Red Dead Redemption 3, if we do get the same map and we do go back in time, even more, this is a place that we could visit, because it could just make it that much cooler as a town, similar to how Tumbleweed is a town in Red Dead Redemption 2, but not in Red Dead Redemption 1. Just in general, Limpany is such an interesting place because all around the town, there are all these barrels of Cornwall tar and kerosene. So some people believe that Cornwall might have been the one that had a hand in the fire that burned down the place. But the only unburned down building is the jail here, and the jail inside of it, you can actually see 2 different prisoners, which is kind of crazy because there are no other dead bodies in the town. It does seem like the town has kind of been burned out for a while, but there still are these 2 dead bodies in the jail, and it seems like no one came here to collect them, and they likely died due to smoke inhalation in the jail because they didn't really have a lot of stuff to get out. And while the jail wasn't going to be burning down because it was made out of stone, unlike everything else in the town, it is still going to get smoke inside of it. But now going over the sheriff's office is actually really cool because in this game, you can actually get a gold bar in the sheriff's office. And if you use a glitch, you can actually get the gold bar to like respawn every single day. So it is just a really cool place to go. And of course, you got to get every single gold bar in the entire game just because they are extremely valuable. So you have to go to the sheriff's office in Limpany to check it out and get that gold bar. And I do want to go back to some of the theories why this place did get burned down. Again, a lot of people think that Cornwall tar and kerosene did it because they have all these barrels spread around. But I feel like this is very unlikely for them to do this unless someone in Limpany did something really, really bad to them. And I feel like having something that burned down an entire town is a little bit worse than some of the other things they did, where they're only like taking out one person instead of burning down an entire town, especially one that has done a lot of business with them. It likely is that this was just an accidental fire and that there really isn't anything deeper going on here because, again, probably a lot of places did burn down during this time frame. And the fact that they have a lot of like tar and kerosene things, it does make it more likely that the town burned extremely quick and just had a great time after they had all these barrels of oil burn on fire. So the fire was probably extremely quick if it was like barrels of oil or tar and kerosene. I don't really know what it could have been, but it doesn't seem like any of the barrels themselves burned, so I don't really know what's going on here. Maybe someone just littered these barrels around the camp after the fact. I don't know. It's a pretty interesting place to explore, though, because it really is kind of a cool town to go into because there are all these different things going on. And clearly it did seem like it's a much bigger town than something like Pleasance or a lot of these other abandoned towns because there was a full saloon here. And a lot of places in Red Dead Redemption 2 don't even have a saloon. So the fact that Limpany has like a full saloon, all these big houses there, and a general store there, it probably is a better town than most of these places. And I'm just kind of wondering what the reason for Limpany being right here was. Valentine is also extremely close to this area, so what's the reason they wanted Limpany here instead of somewhere like maybe in the middle of the Heartlands or someone else in New Hanover? I just feel like there could be like a competing town thing with Valentine being so close. It does seem like Limpany would be a super interesting place to explore in future Red Dead Redemption games. I really wish they could have done it in like Red Dead Online where they had the town burned down during like a huge event. I feel like just having something a lot closer to like Helldivers where you have like an evolving map over time could be cool for something like Red Dead Redemption. I guess you wouldn't be able to do it during the actual game itself because then that kind of ruin the stuff that happens in 1899. But just having like an event where Limpany burns down, it does seem like Limpany burned down very recently to the game because while it is burned in Red Dead Redemption Online, there are a lot of references to the burning actually happening and people saying that the burning shouldn't have happened because there's some reason that they could have stopped it or something. I don't know what was really going on here. I'm assuming this is just an accidental fire that just kind of spread out of control because they had all these barrels of tar and kerosene there, and there likely really isn't anything malicious to it, unlike Pleasance where there clearly is a lot of malice to that one. But overall, I really love Limpany, and I think if you haven't explored Limpany, you should definitely explore it in Red Dead Redemption 2. Thank you guys for watching this video. Here are more videos that you need to watch right now.